Welcome back to Into the Gray. If you spend enough years patrolling the same stretch of highway, you eventually feel like you've seen just about everything it has to offer. Every kind of crash, every excuse, every traffic stop you can imagine. And then, every once in a while, a night comes along that's so unexpected, so unique, that nearly 30 years later you can still picture it like it happened yesterday. For me, that night was March 30th, 1997. It was the last day of the Major League Baseball spring training schedule. Now, I'll admit I wasn't paying that much attention to the schedule, because as a lifelong Pittsburgh Pirates fan, I'd already convinced myself another disappointing season was waiting just around the corner. That's what being a Pirates fan does to you. It keeps your expectations comfortably low. That evening, I was working on the AA highway in Bracken County, Kentucky, doing what every trooper does on patrol, watching traffic, looking for problems before they become tragedies. Traffic was moving along pretty smoothly. The speed limit was 55, and most drivers were running somewhere between 60 and 65. Nothing unusual. Without warning, a gold, full-size van pulled into the opposite lane and blew past 4 vehicles in one aggressive pass. My radar unit didn't just chirp. It practically screamed at me. I looked down just to confirm what my eyes had suspected. 87 miles per hour in a 55. The van eased back into the northbound lane and came flying past my cruiser without the slightest hint of slowing down. I spun the Crown Vic around and started after him. It actually took me close to a mile just to work my way through the traffic he passed before I could even catch up. Finally, I closed the distance, hit the blue lights, and the van pulled safely onto the shoulder. I positioned my cruiser behind it, grabbed my flashlight, walked up to the driver's window. The van had Ohio plates, which wasn't unusual. Folks from across the river traveled the AA highway all the time, and more than a few treated it like it was Talladega. Inside sat an older gray-haired gentleman behind the wheel and a woman in the passenger seat. I introduced myself. "Good evening, sir. I'm Trooper Hall with the Kentucky State Police. The reason I stopped you is I clocked your vehicle at 87 in a 55-mile-an-hour zone. May I see your driver's license and registration, please?" The driver immediately apologized. "I'm sorry I was going so fast. I was just trying to get around those other cars." The second he spoke, something clicked. I knew that voice. I couldn't place it immediately, but I knew I'd heard it countless times before. It was one of those voices that seemed familiar enough to belong in your own living room. As he handed me his license, I glanced down at the name. "Thank you, Mr. Nuxall. Can I get your registration?" Then I looked back at him, then back at the license. I actually remember thinking, there's no way. The name read Joe Nuxall. Suddenly, everything made sense. The voice wasn't just familiar, it was legendary. If you lived anywhere around northern Kentucky or Cincinnati back then, Joe Nuxall wasn't simply a former baseball player. He was the voice of the Cincinnati Reds. For decades, he welcomed fans onto 700 WLW and called Reds games with a style that made you feel like you were sitting beside him in the broadcast booth. Even as a Pirates fan, I found myself listening to Reds games many slow nights while I worked. Joe had one of those voices that made baseball feel comfortable, familiar, and somehow slower than the rest of the world. He also happened to hold one of baseball's most incredible records. At just 15 years old, during World War II, Joe became the youngest player to ever appear in a Major League Baseball game. That record still stands today. But standing on the shoulder of the Double-A highway that night, he wasn't a broadcaster. He wasn't a baseball legend. He was simply the driver I'd stopped for speeding. I explained what I'd seen. Mr. Nuxhall, I understand you wanted around those cars, but they were already moving 5 to 10 over the speed limit, which is what we usually allow. You passed every one of them and went by me at 87. That's why it took me so long to catch up. He didn't argue. He didn't complain. He didn't ask for any special treatment. He just smiled and said, I apologize. We've been driving back from spring training, and I was just ready to get home. There was something refreshing about that. No excuses, no attitude, just honesty. In Kentucky, driving 25 miles per hour over the speed limit qualifies as reckless driving, which means a mandatory court appearance. I had discretion, and like every officer, that's something you try to use wisely. Because he was respectful, cooperative, and completely honest, I reduced the speed on the citation. It still held him accountable. He still paid a hefty fine. But it spared him the reckless driving charge, the mandatory court appearance, and significantly reduced the impact on his driving record. I handed back the paperwork to the polite gray-haired gentleman. He thanked me sincerely. I wished him a safe trip home. And that was that. Or so I thought. A few weeks later, the telephone rang. It was a reporter from the Maysville newspaper. She'd been reviewing court records and noticed something unusual. Joe Nuxhall had received and paid a speeding ticket in Bracken County. She wanted the story. One of the first questions she asked was, Did you know who he was? I laughed and told her, I recognized the voice before I recognized the face. I just needed to see the driver's license to convince myself I wasn't imagining things. Then she asked another question. Did you ask him for an autograph? No, that was not the right time to ask. A traffic stop isn't the place for autographs or souvenirs on any occasion. People deserve professionalism, whether they're a factory worker, a school teacher, or someone whose voice has been coming through radios across the Midwest for the last 31 years at that time. She thanked me, and a few days later the article appeared in the newspaper under the headline, Right Foot Gets Old Left-Hander in Hot Water. I had to admit, it was a pretty clever headline, given his sign-off at the end of every game was, This is the old left-hander, rounding third and heading for home. She did make one mistake, though. She called me a Reds fan in the article. As a diehard and suffering Pittsburgh Pirates fan, I considered requesting a correction. But I decided to let that one slide. The funniest part came afterwards. Word spread quickly around the area. If you know Northern Kentucky, you know Reds fans are everywhere. Some of the good-natured teasing I got made it sound like I'd written a ticket to Santa Claus himself. Couldn't you have let Joe go? You ticketed Joe Nuxhall? You know who that was, right? Of course I know who he was. But that's the point. Whether you're famous or anonymous, whether people recognize your face or just your voice, everyone deserves to be treated with respect. Everyone deserves fairness. And everyone deserves to be held to the same standard. Looking back now, what I remember most isn't writing a ticket to a baseball legend. It's meeting a genuinely kind man who accepted responsibility without complaint. In this job, those encounters stay with you just as much as the difficult ones. Thanks for taking a walk into the gray with me today. I'll see you a little further down the road.